Imagine waking up on the 4th of July and reaching for a heavy winter coat. In the summer of 1816, the sun didn't just set. It suffocated behind a dry, ghost-white fog that tasted like burnt bone. Deep in the American Northeast, birds fell mid-flight, frozen solid in the middle of a July afternoon. In Italy, the snow didn't fall white, it fell blood red, staining the Alps in a scene straight out of a nightmare. People didn't call this climate change, they called it the end of days. This was a decade where the sky turned purple, the moon turned blue, and the atmosphere itself seemed to declare war on humanity. History books call it a volcanic anomaly, but the survivors knew the truth. The world had simply broken. Today, we're peeling back the frost to see why the 1800s were full of weather that shouldn't have been possible. And trust me, number 5 will change how you see the world outside your window forever. Number 1, the day the earth shuddered. It all started with a sound. In April 1815, Mount Tambora didn't just erupt, it literally blew its own head off. The blast was heard over 1,600 miles away, so loud that British soldiers in Java thought they were under heavy artillery fire. They scrambled to their posts, expecting a war that wasn't coming from an army, but from the earth itself. This was the most powerful volcanic event in recorded human history. It was 10,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. But the explosion wasn't the scary part. The nightmare was the 150 cubic kilometers of dust and ash that shot straight into the stratosphere. It created a stratospheric veil that wrapped around the planet like a cold, suffocating shroud. Imagine a giant, invisible umbrella blocking out the sun for an entire year. The world went dim. By the time 1816 rolled around, people were waiting for a spring that simply never arrived. In May, a killing frost wiped out every green thing in the soil across New England. In June, 2 massive snowstorms buried parts of Canada and the northern US in a foot of white powder. Imagine trying to celebrate the summer solstice while shoveling snow off your porch. Irony is a cruel mistress, isn't she? While children were starving because the corn wouldn't grow, the sky was putting on the most beautiful show in human history. The volcanic ash turned sunsets into vivid, hellish shades of orange, crimson, and neon pink. Artists like J.M.W. Turner painted these blood skies without ever knowing they were looking at the debris of a dead mountain. But you can't eat a sunset. Food prices tripled, and people began eating famine bread made of sawdust and dried grass. Riots broke out from Ireland to Switzerland as the social order began to freeze over. But here is the twist. While the world was freezing, something even more impossible was happening in the clouds. Something that should have been physically impossible. Number 2, the ghost in the sky. It was called the dry fog. Usually, when it rains, the air clears and the world feels fresh. But in 1816, the rain was useless. A thick, brownish-gray haze settled over the Atlantic and Europe, like a dirty blanket that refused to be tucked in. It was so dense you could look directly at the sun at high noon without squinting. And what people saw up there terrified them. Massive dark spots were crawling across the surface of the sun, visible to the naked eye for the first time in generations. To a world without Google, it didn't look like a solar cycle. It looked like the sun was rotting in the sky. The fog didn't just look weird, it felt wrong. It was dry to the touch and smelled faintly of sulfur and scorched earth. In London, people reported that their laundry would come off the line smelling like a match had been struck right under their noses. Then, the sky decided to get even more creative. In Maryland, it started raining black rain that stained the whitewashed houses like ink. In Hungary, the population woke up to find their fields covered in a thick layer of bright yellow snow. And in Italy, the snow fell in a deep, terrifying crimson. Imagine the absolute panic. You're already starving because the corn died in June, and now the heavens are weeping blood. Doomsday preachers didn't even have to try. They just pointed at the horizon and watched the collection plates fill up. But while the religious were praying, the sailors were noticing something even more disturbing. The wind was behaving in ways that defied the known laws of physics. Hurricanes were forming in the dead of winter, and the temperature began swinging by 50 degrees in a single afternoon. The very clockwork of the atmosphere had been smashed. But as the world turned into a frozen, colorful hellscape, the most impossible part wasn't the weather itself. It was what the weather was forcing people to do just to survive the night. Number 3, the darkest summer ever spent. Hungry people do desperate things. By the middle of 1816, The year without a summer had turned the world into a real-life survival horror game. In Europe, the bread riots weren't just protests, they were battles. Families were caught wandering the roads, their faces stained green from eating grass just to stop the stomach cramps. It was the greatest man-made and nature-made disaster of the century, but it had a strange, dark side effect. While the peasants were starving, a group of bored, wealthy writers were trapped inside a villa near Lake Geneva. Lord Byron, Mary Shelley, and their friends had planned a sunny vacation. Instead, they got 10 straight days of violent, impossible lightning and a sky that stayed charcoal black at noon. Trapped by the hellish weather, they had a contest to see who could write the scariest story. Mary Shelley looked out at the lightning and imagined a monster made of dead parts brought to life. Frankenstein wasn't just a book, it was a literal product of a volcanic winter. The monster was a reflection of the cold, dead world outside her window. But while literature was being born, the rest of the world was moving. Tens of thousands of farmers in New England packed their wagons and abandoned their homes forever. They were fleeing the frozen hell of the East, triggering one of the largest migrations in American history. They headed west, searching for warmth that didn't exist. And then, just as they thought they'd seen the worst, the sky decided to pull a new trick. Imagine waking up in 1833 and seeing the stars literally falling from the heavens. Not one or two, but 72,000 fireballs per hour, screaming toward the earth. The people of the 1800s didn't think it was a meteor shower. They thought the sky was finally, officially, coming down. Number 4, the night the heavens leaked fire. November 12th, 1833. If you were alive then, you didn't need a clock to tell you it was 2 a.m. The sky was so bright you could read a newspaper in the middle of a field. The stars weren't just twinkling, they were falling. Thousands of fireballs per minute were screaming through the atmosphere. It looked like the universe was unraveling its own seams. People didn't just pray, they waited for the ground to open up and swallow them whole. It was the greatest meteor storm in human history, a celestial riot that turned atheists into believers in a single night. But the 1800s had one more trick up its sleeve. And this one didn't involve fire, it involved an impossible silence. March 29th, 1848, the residents of Niagara Falls woke up, and something was missing. The roar. The sound that had defined the landscape for millennia had vanished into thin air. One of the most powerful forces of nature on the planet had simply stopped. The water was gone. People walked out onto the dry riverbed, picking up bayonets from the War of 1812 as if they were browsing a graveyard. They thought the world was drying up, that the earth had finally run out of steam. They didn't realize that a massive ice jam had turned Lake Erie into a giant faucet that someone had just turned off. For 30 hours, the falls stayed dead. It was a decade where nature seemed to be testing the delete key on reality. But we haven't reached the bottom of the rabbit hole yet, because everything we've talked about, the blood snow, the dark sun, the frozen falls, pales in comparison to the Carrington event. An event so strange it actually made the air itself catch fire. Number 5, the final ghost in the machine. September 1st, 1859. The 1800s had one last nightmare to deliver, but this one didn't come from the Earth, it came from the sun. Astronomer Richard Carrington saw 2 patches of intense white light erupt from the sun's surface. He didn't know it, but he had just witnessed the sun throwing a punch at the Earth. 17 hours later, the world changed. Auroras, usually reserved for the icy poles, screamed across the sky as far south as Hawaii and the Caribbean. In the Rocky Mountains, the light was so blindingly bright that miners woke up and started cooking breakfast, thinking it was dawn. But beneath the pretty lights, the Victorian internet was dying. Telegraph machines across the globe began spitting sparks, burning the hands of operators and setting paper on fire. Then, the ultimate twist. Operators in Boston and Portland realized their machines were still sending messages, even after they were completely unplugged from their batteries. The air itself was so charged with electricity that the wires were running on ghost power from the atmosphere. It was the most powerful solar storm ever recorded. If the Carrington event happened today, your phone would be a brick and the power grid would be a memory within minutes. The 1800s weren't just a century of weird weather, they were a 100-year masterclass in how fragile we truly are. From blood-red snow to fires in the wires, nature spent a century reminding us who's really in charge. We like to think we've tamed the world with our satellites and sensors. But somewhere up there, the sun is still winding up for its next swing. And next time, we might not have a heavy winter coat to hide under. That's all for today. Subscribe if you love discovering the dark side of everyday life and history.